You are listening to Off the Shelf, a podcast by The Conference Board.
Hello, I'm Laura Sabattini, Principal Researcher in the Human Capital Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by The Conference Board. Today, I'm here with Rohit Bhargava and Jennifer Brown to speak about their new book, Beyond Diversity, 12 Not Obvious Ways to Build a More Inclusive World. As we'll discuss in a second, the book presents a variety of insights from the inaugural Non-Obvious Beyond Diversity Summit, which took place this year in January 2021. So the book really presents a lot of knowledge and insights from diversity, equity, and inclusion champions. Before we get to all of that, though, let me introduce you to our guests today. Rohit Bhargava is founder and chief trend curator at the Non-Obvious Company. He's an author, speaker on disruption, trends, and marketing. He previously spent 15 years as a marketing strategist and also teaches marketing and storytelling at Georgetown University. Jennifer Brown is an award-winning entrepreneur, speaker, author, and diversity and inclusion expert. She is the founder and CEO of Jennifer Brown Consulting. And in fact, Jennifer was previously on Off the Shelf to speak about her book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, a couple of years ago. And maybe we'll include a link to that podcast as well. So Jennifer and Rohit, welcome to Off the Shelf.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would like to start with a couple of questions about how your book came about. As I mentioned earlier, your book builds on insights from the event that took place earlier this year. So, Rohit, can you tell us a bit more about the summit and how it informed the idea for the book?
Yeah, the summit was inspired by a question we sometimes, I think, hear in trivia, which is who would you most like to have dinner with? And we kind of thought, well, if we could have that amazing dinner, wouldn't it be cool to have it with people from completely different perspectives all together in one place? And that's kind of how it started. And the ambition was, let's get 10 or 12, maybe 15 people, interview them. Jennifer and I have both done a lot of interviews on our own shows. And so that was a very easy thing to do. And over the course of time, it just exploded. And it turned into, instead of 12 speakers and maybe 3 or 4 sessions, it turned into 50 sessions across 5 days and 200 speakers across so many different topics. And so the summit itself became this amazing gathering point for people who were all sort of fighting the same fight, so to speak, to try and create a more diverse and inclusive world, but doing it in completely different categories. Hollywood casting directors, fitness professionals, people working in public health, people working in government, leaders, chief diversity officers. I mean, they were all doing these things in different places. And so the summit brought them all together.
That's great. And maybe, this is a question also for you, Jennifer. How, with these many contributors and stories and so many participants, how did you decide where to focus on the book and which voices to include?
Yes, that was the rub. It was very difficult to choose. So we went through a writing process where we distilled 12 themes, which were not necessarily identity-based themes, which is typically how we talk about the topic of diversity, and hence the title of the book, Beyond Diversity. We distilled instead all the conversations into themes like education, culture, the future. So we were able to look through the lens, the diversity lens, at different domains, if you will, that affect all of our lives in our, not just our work lives, but our lives more holistically. And we then looked at all this amazing footage and data and stories and planned to share strategically in each of these thematic areas, if you will, insights and research, right? And so it was a very complicated process, and we felt we left some really good stuff on the cutting room floor, but we're hoping to actually capture all of that in another way with like online resources, and who knows, for future summits potentially too.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And it's always difficult, especially considering all the, I'm sure, great content that came from the event, I really enjoyed reading the book. And one of the things I want to ask you, to both of you actually, is, there's at the introduction, you talk about the action focused kind of recommendations in the book. You say this is a book about doing something about inclusion and diversity and inclusion. And it's something that is included at the beginning when you talk about how to read the book, but it's also very clear in each of the chapters and themes. Can either or both of you say something about that? How did you how did you shape the book so that it would provide action focused recommendations?
Yeah, maybe I'll start, Jennifer, and you can jump in after. One of the things that we heard over and over at the summit was people said, we really want this push for more diversity and inclusion to go beyond conversation. And that one comment, which we actually individually heard from, I don't know, like 10 people, just that same phrasing actually inspired the title of the book, Beyond Diversity, because we thought, well, we can't just talk about what should happen. We have to give people real concrete things to do. And so every one of those 12 themes that Jennifer mentioned is a chapter in the book. And at the end of every chapter is a specific summary on one page that says, here are three things that need to happen in kind of our culture or our society or our industries. And here are three specific things that you can do right now, you as an individual. And that was really important to us because we felt that by showing people the big picture and featuring all of these amazing voices and bringing visibility to them, if we paired that with some really descriptive and useful insights and tips based on the conversations we heard and the people we talked to about what people could do, this book would really stand apart from a lot of other things that you might read, which inspire you. And inspiration is wonderful, but it doesn't give you that very specific go and do this. Like go walk, for example, in the retail chapter, we say go walk into a retail environment, look around and see if the aisles are wide enough for someone with a wheelchair to navigate. And if it isn't, go and say something. I mean, that's a very specific thing that anyone can do, whether you're in a wheelchair or not. And that's the level of detail we wanted to get to.
Yeah, I'll build on that, Rohit, that what's really shifted, I think, over the last couple of years, and we're sitting here in the fall of 2021, is, I used to, as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, have to sell people on the why. Why is this important? Why does it matter? What's
Mhm.
being lost? What's being wasted in terms of human potential? And what's really shifted is we're in the how conversation now, squarely in the, I think, the more difficult conversation, which is, now what, and not waiting for someone else to do this work, which I think, as somebody who studies organizations, people wait for the diversity specialist to make the change, or they wait for, the woman in the room to raise the issue that she's the only woman in the room. And I think the call to action of this book is you can create change from wherever you sit in every domain of your life. You don't need to be a leader or in a sort of position of power. You have power, and there are concrete things you can do. And change is going to happen if we can activate people in all realms, at all levels, and at all levels of learning too. I think it's also important to know we have to make this conversation accessible for people that have never been in it before. And I view this book almost as a precursor to the leadership books that I write a lot of, which everybody probably knows that knows my work. It's almost like, let's back up and look at the huge foundation underneath the change that we're all experiencing, because this topic is happening. It's unfolding everywhere around us. So it's sort of this undeniability. But what's so cool about it is we can all jump in and contribute to shaping what's next.
Yes, no, and that's great. And I agree that's a need that you see very clearly in this space. And so before we get in the themes and topics of the book, I was wondering if both of you or either of you can tell me what surprised you the most, given that you're both experts and you both have been doing this work for a while. Is there anything from these conversations or from these discussions that surprised you?
I mean, one thing that surprised me was how much people actually agree without realizing it. Because I think if you pay attention to any media right now, or if you even look at some of the books that have been coming out recently, it's all about how we live in a culture where nobody agrees on anything. where we're so divided, where people are on this side or that side and they think this way or that way and they vote for this person or that person. And that wasn't our experience going through this whole process. And it wasn't because we only talked to people who believe one thing, because we had so many different people from so many different places around the world. And what fascinated me is it's really easy to think that someone sitting over there who lives that life that they live over there sees the world completely different than you because you don't actually have a conversation with them. All you know of them is what you see in a movie or you read in a media story. And as soon as we started fostering those conversations, and that's what we kind of did through the summit, we brought together people in panels. Every one of those 50 plus sessions was a panel. And what we heard over and over again, which was very unique in this space, was people said, "Oh, I had never, not even have I never been on a panel with this individual, but I never even knew what work they were doing, even though it was peripheral to their work." And I think a lot of times what they had, if they went to previous conversations and summits about diversity is they kind of you kind of see the same people. I mean, we have all experienced that. We go to professional conferences and it's like, oh, I saw this speaker at that thing, or it's sort of the same. The people are on the quote unquote circuit, and we didn't have that at this event. And I think what we found by doing that was that we created these beautiful moments of intersection.
Yeah, I would say for me, it is what's so unexpected and yet so true is that the community of change makers is so much bigger than I remember. I think that we can feel very alone. I think we can feel that we're creating change in our own domain and that it's not really resonating more broadly. And so the point Rohit just brought up of this like shared consciousness that we were able to discover and also to enable the discovery of that for others because when you are creating change, there is no playbook. You are literally the first. You are the first person that has done something like in your lived experience, in your identity or your combination of identities. So to me it was a reminder of all the things I don't know that I need to still learn, which was really humbling around identities and how they play out in the world, but also feeling less alone and creating an environment and a container in this book that reminds all of us that actually the work is happening everywhere and we just need to see it and tap into it and gain strength from it because we are literally building a different world together. And the more, to the extent we know about each other doing this work, the more we will be energized by that. I think it's such an important element to sustain our energy because creating change can be exhausting and exhilarating. But in those exhausting moments, you've got to be able to plug in to
Yes.
the community, and the community is vast and diverse and really exciting to behold.
Thank you both. And we're going to take a quick break for some quick announcements, but we'll be back to discuss some of the themes that you just mentioned. And so we'll continue our conversation with Rohit Bhargava and Jennifer Brown about their book, Beyond Diversity: 12 Not Obvious Ways to Build a More Inclusive World.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our conference board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the conference board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Hello, and welcome back to our discussion about the book Beyond Diversity: 12 Not Obvious Ways to Build a More Inclusive World, with co-author Rohit Bhargava and Jennifer Brown. Rohit and Jennifer, before the break, we spoke about the structure of the book, how the book came about, and how to navigate the content, if you will. I'd like to focus on some specific themes and topics that you covered in the book. And I highlighted a few that seemed interesting to me, but I would definitely encourage you to, connect with others. I thought I just threw in a few topics there, but there's so much great content. And so you're welcome to connect with others. The one thing I'd start with maybe is storytelling, and Rohit, wonder if you can tell me a little bit about that theme and why telling stories is important and how we can tell stories differently.
This is one of my favorite topics. I mean, I teach entire courses about this because I think that it's so fundamental to everything we do. And we very intentionally put the storytelling chapter first because I think that when you see the world through stories, it sort of relates things that feel like different industries altogether. I mean, when you consider media and entertainment that we consume, or the story we tell the world about our identity and how we describe ourselves and where we feel at home, or the story, if you think about it in a business sense, in terms of like what you're selling to the world and the marketing and advertising and kind of the promotion that you're doing around it, to how leaders lead and lead with stories to inspire belief. I mean, stories underpin all of those things. And so for us, what was really interesting was to ask some pretty fundamental questions in that chapter around storytelling. And the first one was, who tells the stories? And are we only hearing certain stories because of that? I mean, we all have heard the cliche that history is told by the victors, which is, maybe a cliche, but certainly true. And so we hear this kind of one-dimensional version of what's happened. And now we're seeing the reckoning of that with new discoveries all the time. I mean, I just read yesterday that they found new evidence that 1,000 years ago Vikings were landing on North American soil, or what is now what we call North American soil, right? So I think that stories were an interesting entry point into this topic, and it allowed us to really hone in on, well, what are these stories? Well, how are they shaped? Who tells them? Who should be telling them? And how do we make that more inclusive?
Definitely. And Jennifer, and feel free also to chime in, on the issue of story. But another topic is and theme from the book is identity. And I know you mentioned that in a way you wanted to move beyond identity that is typical, of diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions. But maybe it's a question of telling the identity story differently. I don't know. What was your thought about that theme and how organizations can consider the complexity that comes from personal identities?
Yeah, complex is the word. And I think we're ready for a more complex and nuanced conversation about identity. Those identities that have always made up who we are, but many of which are invisible. So I think that what the workplace is going to need to shift towards is and any domain, is to address identity with our eyes open, to celebrate and name identities as defined by those of us who carry those identities. And I see this shift happening, and I'm so glad to see it, that now what it has not been spoken in the past is being spoken now, more overtly, more courageously. Identities are being shared and brought. I think of it like an iceberg, and they're being brought above the waterline. Whereas before, so many things were stigmatized, and we all have spent so much energy wondering if our identities, plural, are welcome, in any given system that we find ourselves. So this is fundamental to performance, as you can imagine. If you think of yourself in any of the systems you're a part of, that can be schools, that can be your workplace, that can be as a parent, in your family system. When we talk about authenticity, how much of my full self do I feel psychologically safe to bring? This question has been fundamental to me as an LGBTQ plus cisgender woman who's, my pronouns are she, her, hers, but I've been, out and closeted and sort of in and out of authenticity myself. And I know that experience is shared by so many different people who carry identities that are traditionally underrepresented. So we are in the age of identity, but not in the way that the headlines tell us, which is, identity politics and all that. To me, that's a sideshow. What's most important is we want to be seen and heard for all of who we are, and we want to lead from that. We want to show up and be present from those places, because they're very rich wells from which to draw to make our contribution and to move beyond diversity, right? Because some of us that have been in the work a long time, it used to be race and gender. Those are the only dimensions we really talked about. And now look at the palette that is available to us. Look at all the ways we speak about gender identities, pronouns. So we're starting to get really specific, and I think it's beautiful, because the more we can enable people to feel named in their identities, the more that I think, human potential will be unleashed.
Yes, and that's great. And that actually, it's a great leeway into my another topic that I wanted to throw out there, and either one of you or both of you can chime in here about the workplace. It's one of the themes, and I think both the discussions around stories and identity, of course, are very important in the workplace. You know, in your chapter, you talk about cultivating champion, and also you present very practical actions that workplaces can take. Is there anything that you like to highlight from that chapter, specifically the chapter about workplace?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we talk about workplace is a interesting one, because I think a lot of times when people see the two of our names attached to a book like this, they actually assume the entire book is going to be about the
Mhm.
workplace. And what was interesting for us was to take, I mean, we certainly could have, Jennifer has written an entire book about diversity kind of in the workplace in terms of leadership. You know, I've certainly written, most of my books are focused on kind of businesses and how people can think differently. But for us to hone it into this one chapter gave us the chance to really condense a lot of the insights that both of us have learned, but also that we heard from so many other people. So some of the big themes that come out in that chapter, I think, are allyship and what that means. How do you act like an ally? How, as a leader, do you start to create an inclusive culture? So we talk about a lot about corporate culture. I mean, if you just take those two topics, like, these are topics that entire books are devoted to. And for us to touch those in any sort of meaningful way, we wanted to give credit to the people who are doing amazing things. I mean, like Jose Velasco, who's a program manager at SAP, is running an entire program on hiring neurodiverse workers, which is one of the early ones that did that, and really looked at by many in the technology industry as a shining example. And so we wanted to feature examples like that, but we wanted to give people real tips on what to do next. So, how do you, for example, start to embrace your vulnerability at work? Or how do you advocate for a colleague who could use your support? Those were the sorts of themes that came out in that chapter.
Yeah. And we are, I mean, the workplace is being challenged, I think, like never before. And what's becoming apparent is how it was not built to work for so many people of different identities, right? That, work is a big part of our lives, and yet it's not structured in an equitable way. So the work ahead then is to see the workplace experience and workplace culture through different identity lenses, and to shape something that works for more of us, right? That enables more of us to thrive when we bring our full selves into that container. So that's the work ahead for workplace. And Rohit, I am so proud we talked so much about neurodiversity in this chapter, because again, that's not a topic and an identity that is given the platform that it needs and deserves. But it's an identity that is prevalent in any workforce and in many of our families. So it's an example of this, one of these emerging identities that has always been with us, but emerging in terms of visibility, in terms of education, in terms of strategic efforts that organizations can undertake to customize their sourcing, their hiring, their talent strategy to incorporate. That is just one of many identities that has never really been, until very recently, identified as a strength
Mhm.
for the organization. So I was really happy to really choose very intentionally in this book, as Rohit and I were going through and writing it, to say, what is not being talked about, and what do we anticipate and forecast will be talked about a lot in the future. And that was one of those identities we really wanted to dive deep into.
Definitely. And you make a good point that workplace is one of the themes and topics and chapters, but the book is really not just about the workplace, and you talk about building an inclusive world, so to speak. And so you can definitely get the sense that many of the recommendations and insights that you provide here go beyond things that you can do at work. Though, of course, organizations are part of the world, and often they're very important in driving diversity, equity, inclusion trends in the communities where they are, so to speak. And what are some of the hopes you have for the book in terms of how people will use it?
Well, I think one of the things we hope is that it sparks really meaningful conversations that lead people to do things differently in their lives, their personal lives or their professional lives. And one of the things we really invested a lot of time and effort in is trying to create what we called conversation starters to make that happen. And so at the end of every chapter, in addition to those very descriptive things we talked about before in terms of here are the things you can do, there are a couple of provocative questions that are indicated as conversation starters. And if you go to the online resources part of the book, you can download a PowerPoint presentation that has even more. So we have, I think, like 6 or 7 conversation starters per chapter, and the idea behind those was that anybody, whether they're a professor teaching a class or a corporate professional doing a PowerPoint presentation, they could just grab those slides. And we did them in a way that, we've often done in the past, which we call stealable slides. Like, we want people to steal them. We want them to grab those slides, stick them in their presentations, and use them to inspire these types of conversations. And so we wanted to try and make it as easy as we could to not just read the book and consume it, which is a solitary experience usually, but also be able to take some of these materials and put it in front of a group, a class, a bunch of colleagues, a book club. I mean, we wanted to create these ways for people to have conversations that would be inspired by the book, but not limited by just reading the book.
That's great.
Yes, and I'm really proud of these online resources that we've made available. I just wanted to highlight a couple of them. At various points, we point folks to a link to download, for example, inclusive children's books. We ended up talking about how critical it is for every generation to see themselves and their stories and their identities reflected. And so we had fun with that, gathering that and making that a downloadable resource. We're also going through and gathering VC and angel and venture capital funding sources for non-traditional or underrepresented founders. So if somebody has entrepreneurial dreams, they can download a resource where they can go find the right community that is dedicated to their success, that is built by and for their success, and these are, it strikes you, and it's important to remember that these are resources that have not existed in the past. And if they have existed, they're kind of all over the place and they haven't been pulled together. So part of what we've really committed to doing is making this extremely concrete for the reader to say, I'm inspired. Now I know that support is out there. Now I know that there's community for me to access. As I am a change maker, I'm going to need to find my community, and my community is the people who share my passion, perhaps people who share my identity. And, the funding sources have been, I think, extremely poor traditionally for non-traditional, entrepreneurs. And it's been one of the reasons that we don't see enough non-white, non-cisgender male founded companies or funded companies. So I know Rohit and I are very passionate as business owners ourselves to say, we didn't have those role models. We didn't have, a community to point to, but we're not going to let that happen to anybody on our watch. So this was what kind of informed the kinds of resources we pulled together to say, we want to give you a shortcut to exactly who you need to meet, how you need to think about it, and to be really, frankly, proud of who you are as you go on this really important journey to being the first, and hopefully the first of many.
That's great. And as you know, I had a very long list of topics and resources that I wanted to cover. Of course, half an hour is short, but what you provided, I think, will be very helpful for listeners and encourage people to go on those websites and go over the book and get those resources. So I appreciate you providing all these helpful information for people to understand what you were putting together. And so this is of course, a podcast about books. And one of the things that we like to do to wrap up the conversation is to ask for suggestions about further readings and things, or maybe, books and resources that you found helpful or interesting in your own work. Are there any other books that you'd like to recommend to listeners?
Wow, how much time do you have?
I know, right?
We have, I mean, our bookshelves are stacked up with a ton of books, and we always try and share them. I mean, I guess maybe what I can do from my end is just share a book that I read recently that
Yeah.
that I thought was really interesting. It was called Minority Feelings, and it was all about the Asian American experience and how Asians in particular can often feel like an ignored demographic in this whole conversation of black versus white or black and white. And I really related to that because I come from an Indian background. I was born in India, but I grew up here in America, and I lived in other countries as well. And so that perspective really spoke to me, because when you think about the Asian American experience specifically, like, it's not one thing. There's Vietnamese Americans, there's Indian Americans. Like, we all have these kind of different perspectives that we come at the world through. Obviously, we're colored by where we grew up. Did we grow up in Asia and then come here? Did we kind of leave when we were a baby, like I did, or were we born here, like our parents, or were our parents born here? So that was one book that really I thought was well written, and just a great, unique perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Rohit. I would say, Laura, I'll give two. One is, and this is from two perspectives, right? As I sit here as a white cisgender woman, LGBTQ woman, I want to learn about other identities and that experience of that identity. And that's part of my path I walk as an aspiring ally. So one author I read everything she writes is Minda Harts, and she was actually a speaker in the Summit and quoted in the book. Her new book is called Right Within: Healing from Racial Trauma in the Workplace. I would recommend that book. Is not just for Black talent, right? I need everybody to know we should be reading about other experiences that are not our own. As an observer, as somebody who needs to be a champion, as somebody who needs to activate our allyship. And speaking of allyship, my friend Melinda Epler just wrote a book called How to Be an Ally. And it is literally, it's so thorough. And if anybody asks me after reading this book, Jennifer, I just don't know where to start, I don't know what to do, I say, go back and read it again, because there's so many tactics and there's so much language in it and there's so much learning in it. And so, Melinda's work on allyship, she's given a TED Talk on allyship too, which has like 1 million views. So the conversation about activating our solidarity and the levels of privileges that we have and advantage that we have is equally as important these days as honing in on our diversity stories and understanding how those have played out in our lives. We can be a lot of things at once, and we need to be present to both the need for allyship for ourselves, but also the need to be an ally and standing alongside those who have not been heard and seen and valued and included. And I think if we can kind of get that equation together and work in both of those aspects of who we are, I think we'll make change a lot more quickly.
Yes, those are great recommendations. And Jennifer and Harit, thank you for speaking with us today. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in the conversation. For more information about the book Beyond Diversity, 12 Non-Obvious Ways to Build a More Inclusive World, you can visit the website, nonobviousdiversity.com. It's all one word, nonobviousdiversity.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to Off the Shelf book discussion series, or to explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board. You can find the programming on our website at conferenceboard.org/podcasts. This is Laura Sabatini from the Conference Board, and thank you for joining us today.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.